Welcome back to FinTalk, brought to you by VERMEG. Here we discuss pressing topics in fintech, regtech, covering regulatory, collateral and digital across banking, insurance and finance. VERMEG has been proud to deliver innovative software solutions in these industries and stability and cost efficiency for a global roster of clients. With over 20 years of trusted transformation in finance and insurance, we're bringing industry top experts to the FinTalk. I'm Jared Akhtar and I'll be your host for this podcast. Today we are continuing on the topic of the regulatory reporting. And for today's guest, we are proud to have one of our partners who have been in the regulatory and risk industry for over 2 decades. Between them, there is a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Vishwas and Brain Momo. Hi Vishwas, hi Brain.
Hi Jared, hi, good to be here.
Hi Jared.
You guys want to introduce Avantage and yourselves?
Sure, if I may go first. So I'm Vishwas, I run the UK business at Avantage Reply. We are a risk strategy and technology consulting firm with over 10,000 people globally. We work with some of the largest corporate investment banks, retail banks, insurance, asset managers, and custodian financial services institutions through our network across the globe. And my personal experience has been in the prudential regulatory sector, risk transformations, change programs for some of my largest clients, and more recently, a lot of focus on reg reporting and ESG/climate change. In addition to my work from a professional services industry perspective, I'm also a non-executive at Miracle, which is a Scotland-based charity for mental health issues, and something that balances out my experience on professional services with the more pressing societal concerns. That's me, Brain.
Thank you, Vishwas. Brain Momo, been with Advantage for coming up to 6 months now. So I'm a manager at Advantage, like Vishwas said, a strategy, reg, and compliance business consultancy. Previous to Advantage, I've kind of worked across different tier 1 banks in industry. I've worked with the likes of Bank of America, Barclays, HSBC, even had a stint with the Bank of England. So, I mean, my background has been traditionally reg reporting. I've done a bit of stress testing, I've done a bit of data work, and more recently into consultancy. So there's definitely lots in here to talk about. And obviously my experience kind of lends itself to that. So, really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. There's definitely a wealth of knowledge here, and I'm sure we can tap into your expert knowledge and see what we can provide to our listeners. So just casting our mind back a few months at the VERMEG's annual conference, Vishwas, you were really kind enough to participate on our Dear CEO panel discussions with other like-minded industry experts. I just wanted to get your thoughts on the event and more importantly around the thoughts and responses raised at the panel discussion. I know it was we managed to cover quite a lot of topics and a lot of areas. There was a lot of interesting thoughts. I think you mentioned your quote of, if I can quote you, the reg reporting being the lesser cousin of financial reporting. I think that was one that stuck out to all our clients and prospects at the discussion. So it was a really thought-provoking session. So I'm quite interested to see your points and what your feedback was as well.
Sure, and I must compliment VERMEG on the quality of the event and the quality of the debate that we had. The point I would like to emphasize, typically in this context, would be that when you look at reg reporting, as a discipline, it's young, it's evolving, and it's been around for less than 50 years in the financial services industry. And when you look at financial reporting, that's the first roots of financial reporting was set somewhere around the 13th, 14th century with the invention of the double entry bookkeeping system. So financial reporting by itself has had a much longer development lead time with lots of false starts, lots of progress, harmonization of standards, harmonization of international practices. And reg reporting is currently on the same journey, but with a much later head start, if I may say so. And to that extent, we as the financial services industry have quite a lot of ground to cover before regulatory reporting becomes a mature, standardized, harmonized discipline, which regulators can rely upon appropriately, which firms can rely upon for their internal needs, and the wider society, wider consumers of reg reporting can rely on consistently as well. So there is a way to go in that story. And the recent regulatory focus on reg reporting comes from this challenge that we have of lack of consistency, lack of definition, clunky processes, lack of accountability. And all these issues need to be solved for over the next few years if reg reporting is to come to the right level of maturity as financial reporting. Of course, there's quite a lot of overlap between the two. Financial reporting forms a bedrock on which you'll do your reg reporting ultimately. But as I say, the landscape is still evolving. There are a number of issues, challenges that firms are grappling with. I'm sure listeners on this podcast and financial services participants are aware of some of the recent events around fines that regulators have levied in the UK for reg reporting. They've been significant. And it just goes to show that regulators are attaching more and more importance to the quality of these artifacts because stakeholders, investors, clients of banks, financial institutions are going to increasingly rely on these reports or the metrics underlying these reports, sorry. And if you look at regulators, they use these reports and data points for making policy decisions. And to calibrate policy in a fine-tuned manner, you need to have the right regulatory reporting. So there's a lot going on here. And of course, I think we'll touch upon some of these points as we go along. The next one point I'll make here, and I'll stop for some time on this, is over the last 20, 25 years, initially the focus of the regulators was on ensuring that the right principles are articulated when it comes to the quality of regulatory reporting. But over the last 10 years now, more and more standards are being set explicitly by regulators about what they expect from regulatory reports, from the interpretation of individual data points to how those data points come together to form a meaningful set of reports. And the regulators are not afraid of taking stringent action where those expectations are not being met. And that, I think, is a departure from practices even going back 10 years. More recently, you've started seeing this trend of significant regulatory penalties being levied, Section 166 being commissioned, and the expectation that more Section 166 will be commissioned for financial services firms as we go along. So some of these things to keep in mind as we go through and discuss further.
Yeah, there's some really interesting points there you mentioned, and I know we talked about that at the conference and offline as well. We kind of discussing it in our panel. It's interesting that you mentioned clunky, lack of accountability, but even with the introduction of the SMR regimes, you would have thought that kind of accountability is still not quite there, right? It's still not. It's still. You would have thought that would have, even the personal fines that have been going out in the industry, we've seen, right, over the least past 5 years, the amount of personal fines that have been issued as well. You would have thought that would have kind of, accelerated the reduction of the clunker system, legacy system, and things like that. So, just if I can, just ask you to kind of just dig in that into the SMR side of it. It was a point that I mentioned in the letter itself about the responsibility is kind of too far down the line. It is down to the users, the operations. Actually, it should be higher at the board level, the senior managers level. How do firms get around that? What's from your experience as well?
Well, there's certainly been progress, I would say, over the last 5 to 7 years in establishing accountability for the quality of regulatory reporting at nearly all regulated firms. There are two challenges, I think two fundamental challenges that firms face in pinning down accountability. First of all, reg reporting, while can be channelized to one SMF function, it relies on a multiplicity of systems, functions, individuals to bring it all together. So while you can pin down accountability on a certain individual, there's an organization-wide program of improvement that needs to happen before that person can be sufficiently empowered to be accountable. And that is a significant challenge with reg reporting. The second big challenge is the fact that particularly in large, complex, multi-jurisdiction environments, it's very difficult, and firms find it very difficult to pin down responsibility in a way that leads to better outcomes. Why I say that? You are talking about several hundred to several thousand individuals working on various elements of various data points that need to go through a transformation process to become valuable for reg reporting. And it is extremely difficult to control the quality of that input, that process across layers of organization and to claim accountability for it. And that is what larger firms are also struggling with at the moment. I was doing one of my programs, I would say 4 or 5 years back, was around the new PRA leverage ratio report, which came out for larger firms with a daily expectation of some calculation. Some denominator calculations for the leverage exposure had to be done on a daily basis. And you can imagine for a large firm to get the numbers right on a daily basis requires a significant overhaul of your underlying systems and processes. And even with the best will in the world, the entire process, one, remained manual, and second, it was very difficult to get sign offs internally to make sure that individual accountability could be pinned on it. But as you imagine, from an SMCR perspective, a person is held accountable for something that they can't logically execute in the short term. So it is about, if you want to fix the problem in that sense, it requires a multi layered approach which touches upon hundreds of thousands of individuals and how they do work, several complex processes which are spread across time zones, products, systems, and so on. And you need the support of a technology platform or technology solution which allows you to do that. Until that capability exists, even when you identify a particular individual as being accountable for this problem, it's very difficult to implement that accountability in practical, real terms. All SMFs who have the responsibility on reg reporting have to rely on more junior people down the value chain to make the assertions or attestations that they're comfortable with reg reporting. And I think, again, cascading that personal accountability at the top down to individual accountability at the more bottom layers of the organization is extremely challenging. So, what we're talking about are real design questions, process questions, technology questions that must be answered before that accountability actually becomes real in practice. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's a complex problem to articulate.
It is, and I think it's an issue all firms have, right? And the levels and how you've explained it in terms of larger jurisdictions, larger firms with multi jurisdictions, multi time zones and everything. And you mentioned about the technology factor, right? So there's definitely something that VERMEG can help with, and that's what we built into our systems, into the workflows and things like that. So it's it's an area that can be addressed and should be, and it'll be interesting to see how we can, as a software provider, can deal with that as well. I just want to lean on to Brain, if I could bring you into this. I know your vast amount of experience in this industry. I'm quite interested to see from your point of view the current state of the reg reporting and a very generic high level and its immediate pitfalls that you've seen from being a practitioner. But also in a sense where firms look to now be kind of more proactive rather than reactive.
Absolutely, I think that's an important question, Joad, and thanks for having me again on your podcast. And Vishwas has mentioned quite a few already, and when you think about the state of it, I mean, there's no better way to reflect or epitomize the state of the reg reporting layout by just looking through the SEO letter, which came out in September last year. I think when you read that, I mean, there's been a few in the past, the SEO letters, but that really, it kind of like you can almost taste the frustration of the PRA on that letter in terms of, words like frustration and from slow progress. It's quite obvious that, they feel it's been slow in terms of the progress reg reporting is making compared to what you've had in financial reporting. And I know Vishwas has given us a spiel about, the history and financial reporting having a head start, and obviously making the reference like it's a reg reporting being a junior cousin. I don't think it's any less important. But I think if you look at that letter, it mentioned words like lack of focus and prioritization and investments, and it's easy to see that obviously these are areas that have to be worked on. And I've actually been lucky enough to work for the PRA and be in the Bank of England, and I've always said that it's a really interesting institution. But at the same time, there's some, not trying to be controversial, but there are sometimes there's a different sight or lens in how they view things. And I think reading through that letter, I could understand the frustration on one hand, but if you look at the depth of the requirement or the depth of the solution on the other hand, investments is what they get pushed around, but investments on what exactly, in what systems, and just throwing money at the problem doesn't necessarily solve the problem. And I know obviously you work for a technology company, we work for a consultants company, we deal with problems on a daily basis. It's really, really getting to the heart of it. And I know Vishwas has mentioned quite a few. There's the part of governance and ownership, which the PRA is mentioned in the letter. There's the controls aspect, and obviously data as well. And I can understand the frustration. We've had programs like the BCB 239, which has been going on from time, and you're like, what improvements have been made with all this money and time? But it's such a complex web of things. The scale, the amount of people who have to do things, and the subjective nature of reg reporting as well. You have to rely on models as well. As we know, model is only as good as whatever assumptions you give it. And even with two firms might have a completely different view on how things have been interpreted, depending on what the products, how they present the products, and how they look at things. So, given the nuance with reg reporting, it's unsurprising we're in this position. But not to say we can't do more. Firms cannot do more. I think there's definitely aspects firm can improve on. And I first thing comes to mind when I think about experiences and when I've worked in the past, it's I think of how you can easily organize. I think a centralized team, if you have a centralized team or centralized individuals, don't necessarily have to be in one team, but people who have the responsibility of owning certain aspect. And I know we mentioned the having to delegate further down the line, but sometimes given the technical nature of what's required, you only could have someone close enough, but kind of empowering them and giving them a voice to say, well, if you think there's something not quite right, let us know. And it's also the best way to inform what changes would have to be made from a tech and also from a systems perspective. So when I think about reorganization of teams, I think that's a big one. I certainly had an experience of the last when I worked managed a stress testing firm. We had a team, a wider pool of team, not necessarily within my team. I had a central team of people I managed, but within every area like market risk and operational risk, we had people who were, owners of setting key aspect of that report. And also, I think training is a key part as well, because usually reg reporting goes with a lot of system work, and sometimes people have to be comfortable with, working setting system, problem solving it, because the systems don't always do what you ask them to do. And I think a sense of professionalism, because on one hand, people who do this reporting they don't see it as a day job. I don't know. It's usually something you do on the side when that time comes for it to be done, or when there's an ad hoc query. It's not like you come in. They also have other jobs they do, and like they have other things to do on a regular basis. So people always see it as almost like a genuine inconvenience. Oh, I have to do this report. I have to do that. No one sees what I do. So always actually treat like, listen, this is part of your role. Your scorecard and everything, your performance is really based on how well this does. And it's not just about getting through the next reporting cycle, but also thinking, well, we've done it now. What can we do better? How can we improve what we do on a regular basis? So just having a sense of empowerment of the people who actually are responsible. And I agree, yes, it has to be maybe affected at a lower level, but it's the empowerment has to come from a higher up. So I guess that's one of the points the PRA raised around governance and ownership. And I think that's something that needs to be looked at. And also, let's not forget that Vishwas mentioned the fines that's been going. The PRA has a willingness to take penal action, and firms are going to be punished. And that's really, really what emphasizing. And I think that point was reiterated again with the climate adaptation report. And generally, when you think about how things are evolving, it's an area that is looking to grow. So I wouldn't expect firms to rest on their laurels. I would expect firms to, yes, you can do this report now. You have maybe 100 data points, but potentially you have to build your capabilities to be able to have as many data points as possible, to be as flexible as possible. I mean, we've had similar launch of initiatives such as a joint transformation program on transforming data collection. So that's something that's been run by the FCA and BOE. That's launched July last year. I mean, that is obviously it's still very much in the proof of concept state, but that is an indication. Sitting back with firms looking at that is an appetite to do a lot more with data. And I've always felt like the goal would be to have a situation where data just flows seamlessly between firms and regulators pretty much do whatever churn and drive that data to get whatever insight they want. So firms should always be prepared to do a lot more and almost like look in the future and saying this is what we can do to improve our current processes, because it's not going to get any easier.
Yeah, that's so true, right? And I think from you mentioned some key points there. I mean, centralizing teams and taking ownership. I think from both of us, from a consulting point of view, from a technology point of view, I think we both have clients that have come to us to talk about. And you're right in terms of sense of you can't just throw money at it, right? And say, here's a load of pot money, fix it. What are you fixing? Are you fixing data issues? Are you fixing interpretation? It all comes down to interpretation, I believe, as well. So yes, the data, and you mentioned this key about the BCS 239. That's been around for a long time, and that was kind of the bandit to let firms to start actually, fixing their data streams, making it a lot more transparent. Reg systems from our perspective are not black boxes. They're black boxes because you're not willing to invest and understand that, but it's about educating. So we always have key man risk and dependency and things like that. So you make some really good points. And, I know from a technology point of view, from our clients and prospects we're talking to, the areas that they're sticking about, is there, just at a really high level, if there are any firms that have come to you guys as a consultancy firm to say, actually, guys, what should we focus on? What are the key areas that you've seen in the market that may be useful to our listeners?
I think data and technology are part of the problem. They are not the only problem when it comes to reg reporting. When we look at our client interactions and engagements that we've been through, we like to break the problem of reg reporting down into 9 pieces, 9 lenses, what we call them. And those 9 lenses then allow us to focus on areas where the firm is doing well when it comes to reg reporting and areas where there are weaknesses. And typically, any reg reporting program or challenge will go through these 9 lenses and can be viewed through these 9 lenses, if I may say so. So, starts from the scoping of reg reporting, because as you know, depending upon the products you are in, the business you are in, the legal entity that you are, the jurisdictions you operate in, the scope of reg reporting can be very different from time to time. It can rise, fall, change quite rapidly and quite materially over a period of time. So you need to really understand the scope of reg reporting that you are required to be compliant with. Second, you raise the point of interpretation. A number of reg reports need to go through a process of interpretation because a particular data point, as it's defined in a statutory account or in a financial report, might not be the same as a definition for a regulatory report. So you need to clearly understand the regulatory interpretation of every single data point and see what needs to be brought in, taken out, amended, edited, enhanced for that number to make sense for that regulatory report. The third one is an accuracy point, and I'm sure that comes up a lot in your implementations, Jawad. All reports need to be numerically accurate, consistent, and be capable of being validated, both within a particular report and between several different reports. Equally, the validation and accuracy does not only belong in the regulatory reporting space. You need to be able to make sure that your regulatory reports and metrics are consistent with your financial numbers, with any capital liquidity projections that you're making. Because if those numbers are not talking to each other, you have a problem as well. So the accuracy of reg reporting doesn't only sit within the reg reporting world, it goes out as well. The fourth lens is governance. We've talked about it, accountability, steps in the process, who's owning what, job descriptions, and so on. And the next one is documentation, quite well tied in. You might have the right interpretation, numbers are working well, and reports are being churned out, but where is the process defined? How do you make sure that there is fungibility of processes between different people and people understand how their responsibilities are required to be taken forward? The sixth lens is process controls. Where do you have checkpoints, gates, reconciliation measurements to make sure that the regulatory reporting process is working correctly? Seventh is with heart of it, data flows. What data is being captured? What data points are there? What is automated and what is manual? How are you assessing data availability from a timeliness, robustness, completeness, accuracy perspective? Lens 8 is systems and solutions. What solutions are you wrapping around the problem? Which work with the other lenses as well: scope, governance, documentation, interpretation, because the solution has to be scalable for that purpose and allow you to slice and dice, cut, consolidate, aggregate in a way that works for you, not only for today or today's requirements, but for the requirements of the future. And the final lens, which brings everything together, is integration in decision making. Reg reporting is good. It's, you can use it for compliance purposes. You can say, I've submitted CA1 today and I'm done with it. But it's much more valuable if I can use it to make a decision in the business. It moves out from being a compliance object to being a decision making value added object. And so when we think of this problem of reg reporting, and if our clients and if the banking community or the asset management community look at this problem in that holistic way, I think it's easier to solve for in a proper way. You can come to a decision about what's working, what's not working in a meaningful way, and then try to solve the problem because it works in a holistic way, not in parts. You can't just solve the problem by putting a new great solution in place when the other parts are not working. So it's a long-winded answer to say that's how we see the problem of reg reporting, and that's how we like to work with our clients on advising them on this.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point because obviously garbage in, garbage out, right? That's the old phrase, and it's still valid. But and you make that point, and it's something that we at VERMEG are quite keen to stress as well, that there's a lot of information in reg returns. Yes, you're right. You can do the reg return and just file it and put it away in the cupboard. But actually, if you switch it around, and the value in business decisions is huge. From a VERMEG perspective, we do a lot more with our clients about that, and transforming that data into usable business information. So kind of seeing how we go in the future. So that's a really, really interesting point. I just wanted to kind of look forward now and discuss at very high levels, kind of the most recent CEO letters that came out and the plan, the regulators' plans for the future. We saw obviously the reinforcement of the quality of reporting. ESG is a big topic, and there's the climate report that came out. So I kind of just like to get an impact, and that's kind of from your point of view around those letters, and especially around ESG. Because I know, Vishwas, I'm going to ask you to come back, and we're going to talk about that in more detail in a future podcast. So, very high level, how do you see those letters kind of impacting firms, and your thoughts on that?
I think it's ESG especially. It's quite topical at the moment, and we've clearly seen not just letters coming in from the PRA or PRA or regulators showing the importance of it. We've also, from clients' perspective, we're seeing the demand of work and obviously interest, and because I said someone asked me the question once, how do you define ESG aside just a title? I said, well, ESG is not CSR. It's CSR on steroids, if you want to call it that. So basically, we had CSR, corporate social responsibility. We had that years back, where firms are just putting stuff on their annual reports and saying we've done this and that, and that's pretty much almost good enough. But now we have something which is not just backed up by words. It's a lot of quantitative elements going into this now. So that's been pulled together. We've had instances where we know I think it was France, and as regulators, France and the PRA obviously have actual stress testing in place, climate stress tests, and these are going to be backed up by actual scenarios. And it's how do you parameterize those scenarios, and from a quantitative perspective, and it's next level. So firms will actually have to put something on paper, have to do a lot of thinking, have to see how these impact them. So it's essentially saying we're taking this very seriously. We're taking everything to do with ESG quite seriously, and firms have to reflect that. And it's the regulator setting the tone, and it's reflected in those letters. And then that's how I see it. And obviously, when you think about it, it's also good for business. It's not one of those things that I've always think it's not something you do as a tick box. It's obviously good for business. And I think when you think about ecologically, governance and everything happening in the world, and businesses I see them as citizens of the world. I mean, it's a responsibility for them as well, and that it's a show of how well as a firm you think about your environment and how you operate. And I think when you think about what's happened with the pandemic and just the world in general, people begin to ask more questions, and people begin to say, well, it's not just about me having to deal or buy or have my bank do X, Y, Z, but I want my companies I'm engaged with, the companies I want to work for, I want people to do a lot more than just business. And I want them to engage in a caring way, not just for profits, but obviously for the people around and for the environment. So I think it's going to get bigger, and I think it's not a buzzword. It's not just going to fly by. I think we can see the impact of the environment and things in general, and I think the regulators are, they're going to make sure it sticks, and I think businesses are beginning to get that message, and hopefully and continually act in accordance.
And just to add to that, I think from an ESG perspective, last several years, regulators have again started making inroads into what they expect firms to start reporting on from a climate change responsibility ESG perspective in a lot more granular detail. And that poses a barrage of new challenges for firms already struggling with the quality of their as is regulatory reporting, because we're not talking about